Welcome again to Out of Left Field, and today we're going to be talking about France, the country that has escaped the jaws of fascism, or has it? So, Macron, or Macron, or whatever you want to call him, has won the so-called centrist candidate, neither left nor right, who also plans to lay off 120,000 civil servants. So, I'm not sure if I would personally call him a centrist candidate, but at least Marine Le Pen and the racists didn't win, right? Right?
Sure. If you mean, should people be celebrating the fact that a party whose literal descendants were Nazis in World War II? Then yes, this is a good thing,
Can't argue against that.
Yeah, that's great. As far as what actually happened and who ended up being elected and the actual results, there's nothing really to be all that keen about, other than the fact that in France, at least, there is an actual left-wing mass movement that came about, right, with the communist candidate, essentially.
Macron.
Yeah, Macron, who, while he didn't come in even second, he in fact didn't even come in third, he did manage to galvanize, in the space of essentially a couple of months, millions of people around a clear socialist message.
Yeah.
That's good. That's great. Socialist Party is presumably no more, at least for a long time. And even though Macron is the president, he has no actual supporters in the government. He doesn't have any senators or anything like that. No
political party.
No political party. He's an independent. And that's one of those weird things that for people who want to appeal to him as the, everything is good and everything is going to stay as usual, really are underestimating, I think, the impact that his isolation is going to have. The fact that every other party, including Le Pen's, will be able to just, bash him over the head and blame him for every single thing that happens.
Yeah, and I think that, people are saying that, right-wing populism, racism, xenophobia, etc., has been essentially defeated in this election because he won by a very large margin. He got 60-some% of the vote, in spite of Marie Le Pen's very transparent last-ditch effort to resign as leader of the National Front, to try to cut her ties there or whatever that was supposed to do. But I don't think this really means that populism in France has been defeated, because I know you're gonna, as you always hate me for referencing Zizek, but one of the things that he says in First is Tragedy, Then is Farce is that liberalism and extremism are kind of one and the same, two sides of the same coin, essentially, that they're not opposites of one another, that liberalism, in its inability to address the contradictions in society that capitalism creates, it thus generates and creates extremism as a backlash to that. And I think that is precisely what's going to happen in France over the next 4 years. I don't think people should be saying, Marine Le Pen lost, therefore we don't have to worry about racism anymore. The kinds of, Macron, I want to call him Macaroon, is a fucking neoliberal globalist banker. I hate to sound like Alex Jones in using that term, but, truly, he is. He claims to not be left wing or right wing, but he's a banker. Sure. He's a capitalist. He is part of the French ruling class.
That whole not left wing, not right wing thing is less about his politics and more about an appeal to stability. Macron or Macron, whatever, I will not, do anything extreme. I won't do anything that will scare people. I won't do anything that will disrupt the markets, that kind of stuff.
It's that exact kind of wishy-washiness. What's a better term for that? It's that exact sort of not wanting to take any extreme measures or want to make any structural changes or what have you, that the working class in France, just like everywhere else, is grappling with problems of unemployment, service sector jobs that don't pay well. Laying off 120,000 civil servants is only going, these people, a lot of them don't have anywhere else to work. They're going to get thrown into the breadlines just like all the other unemployed. How is that going to help France? That's just going to generate more extremism. That's just going to generate more resentment towards immigrants and more instability in the French economy and amongst working class voters. Like we saw, especially in the final rungs of the campaign, Marine Le Pen sort of showing herself or posturing herself as the working class, if you're an average working person, support me, I'll represent you, in the sort of classic way that right-wing populist movements, neo-fascist movements, white nationalist movements often sort of dress themselves in left-wing rhetoric in order to give working class people the impression that, he's on my side, they speak for me or she speaks for me, right? When in fact, of course, the opposite is true, but it's just keeping with the trend that right-wing, especially extreme right-wing governments or movements rather, have always used left-wing rhetoric to if not for holiday speechifying, but they always do this. And so I think that Macron's policies are going to make the French economy worse and are going to generate more resentment and more instability, generate more of the exact same contradictions in society that caused Marine Le Pen's and the popularity of the National Front, basically.
Well, I agree with you pretty much. I will say I don't think Le Pen's overall, racist, xenophobic, right-wing, and populist, yes, all of those. As far as what her presidency would have looked like, probably very similar to Trump's in the sense that not even in attacks on immigrants, but a lot of seemingly useful solutions that will do nothing to solve the actual contradictions that the country's facing.
Right. Leaving
the EU is not actually going to help France, and it won't even help French capitalists either. It's much like Britain, where there is a section of the French capitalists and a section of the British capitalists who both sort of think that maybe if we leave the EU, we can go it alone and we can, we'll finally be unshackled from all these regulations and bullshit. And while that's, at least on the face of it, sort of true, the problem is that there really isn't an alternative to what is really the problem, which is, a lack of markets to sell products to, a lack of people with money to buy shit, wages are too high to make money, the basic problems of productivity and capitalism that face France and face everywhere else. And Le Pen and Macron, really, neither one of them were offering anything different in that sense. They were offering cosmetic features, either we're going to be in or out of the EU, but that doesn't deal with the real problem France is facing, which is this constant pressure, and austerity being a consequence of that pressure. It does mean that Macron, as let's just call him, Mr. Establishment now, or President Establishment, I suppose we should say.
President-elect Establishment,
President-elect Establishment.
Okay.
I think there's, beyond the sort of comparison between the two of them, because that will eventually just be history. Eventually people will forget about their names as well. But the real issue, I think, that sort of is what makes the French election important, and what makes it something that people around the world have been watching in a way that they normally wouldn't, is this idea that there is a conflict between populism and stability that's been racking the world since 2016. Brexit and Trump being the two most well-known examples, but basically every election since then has had some features of this crisis going on in it. And it would seem, on the face of it, that maybe, liberal democracy has turned the corner and we're back to business as usual. Yes, 2016 was bad, disruptive, maybe even damaging, who knows. But hey, a French centrist, boring, beige candidate was elected, and therefore we're fine now. A liberal is now in power again. The strongest, most important liberal in the world is no longer Justin Trudeau. And, you can wipe the sweat off your brow for that fearful period of time when that was the case, that 6 months when the world had to look to that fucking wet paper bag for leadership. But now we have the French president to look to, apparently. I don't know. I have a lot to say on this, I suppose. But where I guess where I'm going with all this is that I really don't believe that this has actually changed anything, even though it was a substantial portion of the vote that voted for Macron and did not vote for Le Pen. And certainly the media certainly said that this shows that the populist wave has ended, or at least there's a way to defeat it. That defeat comes with no real lessons for liberals, really. I mean, the lesson is the same lesson that Hillary Clinton followed. It is the lesson of moderation, of, point out the flaws of your opponents. Don't really promise it. Don't be too particularly strident or extreme in anything you promise. And kind of just talk a lot about business as usual. And you'll win. Except, you'll win in France and you'll lose in America. So what's the actual issue here? And I think given how, all the accolades that are being lavished on Macron, it seems like liberals around the world have learned absolutely nothing about how to actually win elections and are just sort of assuming that the people love them again for no clear reason.
Well, liberalism at its core can't deal with the contradictions and crisis of capitalism in this day and age. And, that is going to show itself in the next 4 years in France. Liberalism works when capitalism is in a boom period for a long period of time. The economy can offer concessions to the working class. You can have a social safety net. You can have good medical care. But as soon as capitalism cannot all of a sudden afford those, liberals will jump onto the austerity train along with the conservatives in, the bat of an eye. And they don't, liberalism has never been one for a structural critique of how the economy works or capitalism or anything like that. And we've entered into a period ever since 2008 where there's going to be more and more crises. There's going to be more longer crises that happen and that affect the working class in really visceral, awful ways. So I think that in France, by and large, people rejected Marine Le Pen's extremist racist views. But for how long will that be the case? If you accept the fact that these extremist views are being generated because of the crisis of capitalism, because of unemployment, because of structural issues, and liberalism cannot deal with those or will not deal with those, then Macron is just going to be kicking the can down the road another 4 years. The real question is who's going to win, in the next presidential election after he's implemented further austerity.
2021?
Well,
yeah,
sure.
I actually saw someone took a picture of this. It was graffiti in somewhere in France, and it was basically, if Macron 2017, then Le Pen 2021, basically. And it was like, I think that's what'll probably. You're right. That's probably what'll happen. But to me, what's like the bigger problem here isn't even really France and isn't this one particular election, but this whole question of populism and whether or not the people should be allowed to be making these decisions. Because if you asked the same people who are, loving the French today, they were hating Britain a year ago.
For choosing the wrong...
the wrong thing. And so, of course, and I think this both shows a hypocrisy on the part of the media and also plays into the right-wing populist sentiment of like a conspiracy against them, that when the establishment wins, they're congratulated, and when the anti-establishment movement wins, when the populist movement wins, it's blamed for all kinds of things. Everything is to blame, but liberalism, but the establishment. Racism is the real reason, as if racism is the reason why people become racist. Like that's like that kind of thinking here. Like, right. Well, racism causes racism. Instead of saying, well, okay, if there was full employment in France, do you think people would be worried about quote unquote people taking their jobs?
Well, not just France, but anywhere.
Well, anywhere, yes, but anywhere.
You're correct, yeah.
You can't take jobs from the society
from employed
if there's
people.
More people who, if there's more work that needs to be done, if there's work out there to do.
Yeah, if you can put food on the table, there's no point in blaming your neighbors.
You just be like, well, they're weird or different or whatever, but there is a lot of racism there in that sense of just people just kind of not liking new and weird things. But to be honest, that sort of stuff does go away. I mean, people can actually integrate. That is, if anything, that's seemingly one of the fundamental principles of liberalism, is that we can get along together. And yet, these days, it's sort of turned into its opposite. Much like neoliberalism has been sort of taken on the mantle of austerity, it's also taken on the mantle of like structural racism. Like people are just going to be racist, and there's really nothing you can do about it. And therefore, you might as well just keep things sort of separated, equal but separate, and that's really the best you can do because people are terrible, and there's really not much else to say about it. Frenchmen are just going to be racist, and Muslims are just going to be extremist, or whatever other nonsense you want to say. And it's somewhat ironic, but I think, like you said, kind of a consequence of the times we live in, that liberalism has adopted a lot of that logic itself.
Oh, you're absolutely right. And I think that we should mention here Mélenchon, the communist-backed, socialist
Well, he wasn't
candidate.
communist-backed. He was a former member of the Communist Party who also ran as an independent.
Yeah, and he got almost 19% of the vote, and he sort of had a meteoric rise in a few weeks' time. He was the star of the first debate that they had, right?
Yeah.
And I think that just that alone, as you mentioned before, is a case in point for a broad working class, pan-racial, pan-whatever sort of platform that is explicitly not racist, that includes all people of all ethnicities, but a working class platform for workers by workers can garner a shitload of support.
If the discredited Socialist Party had pulled its candidate that would never have fucking won ever, and endorsed Mélenchon, he would have come in first.
By far.
Oh, well, yeah. They were all... I mean, to be fair to the four leading candidates, none of them had anything close to a decisive lead. They were all within a couple percentage points of each other. And I think that speaks as well to the kind of the impasse that both France is in, but also the French voters, that they are not yet seeing any clear benefit to any of these candidates, even whether they're right-wing, whether they're centrist, whether they're left-wing or far left-wing or whatever, whether it's a party you and your family have voted for generations, or it's just some random guy who you hadn't heard of a week ago. There isn't yet any kind of clear choice there.
Well, I think in the case of France, they tried Sarkozy. That didn't work out so well. So yeah, conservatives not so much. So they tried the Socialist Party instead. Why don't we try the left-wing guys? And Hollande ended up being literally the least popular president in French history.
I know, right? I mean, he has unpopularity ratings that are almost as bad as the ones BC premiers get. It was amazingly low. I mean, around 10%.
And this is why, I think that this is another critique of liberalism that I have here, and I'm going to point this one right at the French Socialist Party, who is socialist only a name, because you're not a fucking socialist if you implement massive austerity onto your voters, right? That's just not how socialism works. And so we've seen this trend for the last generation amongst social democratic and left-wing, historically labor-related parties, of this trend towards the center, of not taking a militant anti-capitalist stance against anything, settling for, breadcrumb concessions to the working class, and that is seen as somehow a win against the, austerity that their counterparts make. However, in the case of the Socialist Party in France, they implemented some of the worst economic and austerity policies that the French can remember in recent memory. Why vote for a Socialist Party if they're going to act exactly the same as the people that they're, saying are corrupt and awful right-wing, conservatives?
I was surprised they got 8%, to be honest. 6%. Okay. Yeah, no, I was surprised they really got any votes at all. I mean, the debate was terrible. The party was awful in power. They were almost just sort of giving up on the whole election anyway.
Well, why were they so surprised, though? I read that when the results came in at the Socialist Party headquarters, there was an audible gasp of shock and disbelief when they saw that they got 6%, when they weren't really polling higher than that at any point during the campaign anyway. And so why were they even surprised?
Well, sure, but everyone... I mean, to be fair to people in the campaign headquarters of any party, it does. You do tend to get into kind of a bubble there, but that's sort of a microcosm of the whole problem here. Is that there's these bubbles of logic that have been taking shape in the last couple of years, wherein whatever your political position is, as long as it's a relatively normal one, like you can be a liberal, conservative, social democrat, and that's about it. But whatever, you can find that kind of echo chamber or that kind of reasoning, so that whatever happens, there is some virtuous reason why you failed. It's not because the people hate your politics. It's because of, racism or sexism or the Russians or whatever. And that does provide the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, the Socialist Party in France, the National Front, whatever party you want, whoever you're talking about, it gives them every opportunity to just double down and ignore counter arguments, counterfactual statements even.
Yeah, that reminds me of the Democrats in the United States, who all seem to be tripping over their own dicks to blame everybody but themselves.
But that's exactly the
for
problem.
Their own loss in the election.
That to me is the real problem. In victory, people voted for us because they love us, they want what we're going to do, they support us, we have a mandate. Even though if you were to look at the French election, it's like, yeah, but you didn't even get over 25% of the vote in the first round. So how the hell does that make any sense? Mm-hmm. But that's what they're going to say, and that's basically what the media's been saying.
And when they lose?
Yeah, when they lose, it's,
someone else's fault.
The people didn't understand us. We were it was too complicated. People are stupid, even. They don't understand the issues. Eventually,
yeah, I see that a lot. Like when, especially again, calling back to the United States, where Democratic supporters they just say, well, Trump voters are just stupid. They don't understand things. They're just dumb, and you can't trust them. And that itself leads, the logical conclusion to that argument is, well, people shouldn't vote, I guess, or people are too dumb to have a decision to decide their own destiny, right? Which is nonsense. And another thing that reminds me of is how the voter turnout between the first and the second rounds in the French election was huge.
Oh, yeah.
The difference. Like, you had, I think, between 70-some% of people that voted in the first round, and you had, like, the low 60% of people voting in the second round. So you have, on one hand, there's this sort of cataclysmic change in the French political situation, where instead of the conservatives and the quote unquote socialists, you have the National Front and some guy, and yeah, so that's a big change in French politics. But people also don't seem to be really riled up about this, and they seem disillusioned. People spoiled their ballots. Like almost all of the people that voted for Macron and the more left-wing candidates didn't even really want to show up to the polls, and I think probably a lot of conservative people probably didn't want to show up to the polls either. So
sure. Why would you? At the end of the day, and this is something I think that is important to keep in mind in any election, the only advice I can ever really give anyone as far as who should you vote for is the party, the person, the ideas, whatever that you actually want. And that often does lead to situations where people go, well, I don't like any of these candidates. And then my point is, well, then, you don't have to vote for them. You can go and spoil your ballot. If you think that is the best choice you can make, given the circumstances, then make the best choice. And people did, and people will. And the problem I have with a lot of arguments as far as what was going on in the French election and in the American one as well, because they have so many things in common, is this sort of sentiment you can't not vote. That to not vote, to not choose one of these two awful candidates is to somehow divest yourself of democracy.
Right.
It's somehow your right to have a democracy is dependent on some stupid decision like that. As if that's how rights work. The charter, there's a line in the charter that says, you have a right to vote, or you have a right to a democratic process as long as you vote. That's not what it says. It says you have those rights, and it really doesn't matter what you do with them. That's not the question. And when it comes to these kinds of things, I'm always just fucking irritated by people who treat it like, you have to choose. You not just choose, because let's face it, when you vote for somebody, you're not just, in principle, if voting matters, it matters because you are investing in that person the right to act in your name on some level, or a desire for them to act in your name. However that might work, and I don't like representative democracy, and I think it's garbage, but whatever. The whole point being that representation is what you are investing them with. And if you believe that that's actually the case, then how in the hell could you ever advocate voting for someone you don't actually want?
Well, it kind of defeats the whole purpose of democracy in that sense.
Well, sure, and that's in many ways where liberalism has gone as well. That it is now at the point where it is in both obtusely and in some cases even directly advocating against democracy. In the case of Brexit, or at least in the case of the results of Brexit, it was advocating against democracy quite strenuously. In the case of pre-election results in France, it was advocating against it in kind of an obtuse way. Yes, you don't want this. Yes, this isn't your choice, but your choice doesn't matter. What matters is the stability of the French Republic. And that ends up being the, raison d'etre of the whole political system as a whole, is just to keep things on an even keel. And that's, honestly, there was a time when that might have made some sense, when you had full employment, when you had things working, when it felt like progress was just happening and we didn't need to be actively involved in it. That certainly is a compelling argument under those kinds of circumstances. But in a time of austerity, in a time of crisis, in a time of economic slump, the notion and the argument of telling people to just, vote and then kick up your heels, and the clever people in Paris or in Brussels or in Washington will just make your decisions for you, really rings hollow to me, and certainly rings hollow to more and more people, it seems.
Well, it reminds me of when, during the debates that Hillary Clinton and Trump had, the demeanor that Clinton had seemed to be like, why am I even here? Just let's get this voting process over already so I can be president, and then you plebs can go back to your, watching television and wanking off, and I can do the important decisions of, governing, so the rest of you can just shut up and wait your 4 years to, check a box again, right? And so as time goes on, as capitalism continues to be unable to deliver its promises to people and becomes more and more unable to deliver prosperity to more and more working people, you get this kind of very snarky elitist attitude coming from liberals, the media, etc., that like, oh, well, why don't you just, choose us? Like, why don't you just make the smart choice and then we can make the decisions? It's like, well, you're kind of forgetting the whole fucking point of why people vote, of what democracy is for, about why this is even a good system at all. And so I think that this also reflects itself in how the media portrays these different candidates, right? Hillary Clinton in the United States was the right candidate, and the reason she lost was, oh, it was due to sexism, oh, it was because she was a woman, oh, it was because of this and that. And in the case of France, of course, is the exact opposite case, where Marine Le Pen was an illegitimate candidate because she was a populist, and it all of a sudden didn't seem to matter that she was a woman, and that wasn't a reason she lost, except, of course, for the small amount of liberal feminists that were just eager to celebrate the first French woman president, which, of course, in that context doesn't actually matter that she's basically a neo-Nazi and her gender is more important. But I think it's interesting to see how the media almost unconsciously treats these people in totally different ways. I think that, I hate to beat a dead horse. Maybe it's not quite dead yet, but again, it seems that liberalism, mainstream media, and just the status quo in general is just really unprepared to deal with this wave of populism sweeping across democracies in the West.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I'd say unprepared in an intellectual and even ideological sense, certainly, and definitely in a philosophical sense. There's almost no real philosophical buttressing of capitalism or even democracy anymore from them. It's more just the ideological stuff, or even just rhetorical. Just don't do X because X is unstable. That's really all they can say to people. It's dangerous. Don't touch that. It's very paternalistic. It's treating everyone like children. Don't stick forks in the outlet. That kind of logic is really all we're being offered here from them. But they're certainly unprepared in that sense, in the sense of like actual argumentation, but in the sense of the infrastructure they have, the apparatus available to them. They have all the keys, all the power there. The media is generally sympathetic towards the status quo because, hey, the people who are anti-status quo tend to be, let's face it, right wing for the most part, and tend to hate the media and art and just generally ideas. as well as just the, bureaucrats like to keep things the way they are. They would like things to just stay the way they are. The number of states that should be in the EU should just stay the same, probably because they want to keep the flags the same, if nothing else. Like, that kind of logic does permeate down and throughout the whole kind of operation of governance, to the point where it seems almost imperceptible how little things change in the structure of government sometimes. Wherein, I guess what I'm getting at is that the way in which these people are thinking is not so much about defending themselves against either a legitimate or even an illegitimate opponent, but more like almost like their external enemies are almost like natural disasters, and their job is simply to build, dikes tall enough to keep the floodwaters out, and that's it. There is no argument there. There is no preparation for anything better internally. It's just, how long can we hold on? I think liberalism has sort of retreated into kind of a siege mentality. Defend capitalism, but not even because it's capitalism. Just defend it because it's the system we have. Defend liberal democracy, but because it's just the system we have. The EU exists, therefore it needs to be defended. Establishment candidates exist, therefore they need, they're the establishment candidates, obviously, so they need to be defended. And it's almost like they've not simply abandoned any effort at arguing against, extremist positions, or trying to convince people who are extremists to come to their more moderated position, but almost like they've abandoned even the moderate position at all and have kind of just detached themselves from politics altogether and are now talking less and less about ideas and more just administration.
This reminds me of what I said earlier about the whole liberalism and extremism being two sides of the same coin, that liberalism itself generates that extremism. You have these, let's call them elites, bureaucratic administrative elites that are telling people just vote for the status quo, everything's going to be fine, see, it's worked for the last X number of years, it's going to keep working forever, and dude, people are fucking unemployed. They're pissed off. They are dealing with austerity on a daily basis. Why would they want to vote for the status quo? They want something different, and that's why they're voting for people like Marine Le Pen, even if they may not espouse all the same extreme racial prejudices that she and her party espouse. But just the fact that you had these two outsider candidates come contend for the final round of the French election itself speaks volumes of the fact that people don't want the status quo anymore. The status quo can't deliver to people anymore, and why would anybody think that it still can? And so the kind of populism that we see in France, United States, Britain, and elsewhere is driven by that. That people are upset. There's why even argue in favor of the status quo if it can't deliver full employment, if it can't deliver good, well-meaning, well-paying jobs to people? This is what people are upset about, and the fact that the bureaucratic elites and the political liberal elites don't understand that, even furthermore, generates more resentment, that people feel like they're not being listened to. People feel like they're not represented in government. People feel like they just want something different, And
this gets back around to the question that came up in the last week or so of the French election. The Russians. Apparently, they were involved again.
Yeah,
because why not, right? It's somewhat ironic, I suppose, that apparently the Russians were involved again, but they did such a shitty job in France. Because if we are to assume that elections are determined by, operative insiders, then obviously whoever operated Le Pen's campaign externally should probably be fired. This is sort of one of the funnier things about the kind of logic of blaming electoral results purely on the manipulation of people's minds because, well, I think that is possible and you can get results from that, and money does play a big role in this. The whole thing we've been talking about is the reasons why people are mad, the reasons why people care about these issues, the reasons why people were willing to vote for Le Pen in the first place. All of that is not stuff that has to do with marketing. It has to do with real material conditions that they've been experiencing themselves. And it sort of shows up the whole notion of this kind of conspiratorial idea that elections are determined by foreign entities as being specious at best, but also, more importantly, just not a helpful method for understanding elections. The establishment candidate in France won by a large margin.
Well, he wasn't an establishment candidate, but he was the globalist Europe candidate.
Sure. This guy who represented everything that arguably is wrong with France is now going to be president. And yet, in the media, particularly in the last week or so, there was a lot of talk about the Russians manipulating the election, leaking stuff about Macron to the benefit of Le Pen, obviously. And I guess, to my mind at least, the question inevitably falls to, well, why didn't it work, right? And I think this is why the whole sort of system of appealing to these external forces just is utterly useless. Because the best you can say is, for some reason it worked in America, maybe, and it for some reason didn't work in France, maybe. And I guess it all ends up being kind of just a rhetorical argument for whichever side you wanted to support anyway. If what you wanted to do was support the liberal status quo position, then you might as well just say that the Russian stuff just didn't have an effect because people loved, Macron and hated Le Pen, and that's all there was to it. Whereas in America, if you're a liberal, it was the converse problem. Nobody loved Trump. It was the Russians who tricked people effectively.
Yeah, I agree and both disagree with you. Like, I think that it is important to acknowledge not just the impact that foreign actors can have in an election where we have, the internet, things can be hacked, etc. People's opinions can be swayed through things they see on Facebook, whether or not it's fake news or whatever. This stuff does matter. I think that you're correct in stating that it's more important to focus on the actual material reasons why people are voting for a particular thing. In the case of Trump, there is a ton of white working class rage for a lot of reasons, and that fed into reasons why people decided to vote for him, right? And it wasn't just the Russians meddling in people's affairs, and if only they hadn't have meddled in the elections, then Hillary would have won. That's obviously an overly simplistic view of it. On the other hand, I think it's important to acknowledge that actually, in the age of big data, of Facebook, of the internet, foreign actors like Russia are, successfully or not, attempting to and sometimes successfully intervening in foreign elections. That matters. We have companies that, big data companies that are mining people's information, selling what they call micro-targeted ads, where they target an ad for the individual person. The view of this, not hacking an election, but swaying it, right? Almost every single election that I can think of in the last 2 years has been like 49-51, basically. Like the United States, Ecuador, tomorrow in BC is going to be about the same. Politics is really divided. There are contradictions everywhere, and there's no real clear way forward of how to get out of this capitalist crisis, and there's no one movement that is offering an answer to people. And as such, people are looking in all sorts of different ways of what the answer is. Who do I vote for? Do I vote for the populist? Do I vote for the liberal? Blah, 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 whatever. So from the perspective of someone who is trying to sway an election in a particular direction, all you have to do is convince 1%, maybe 2% of people to vote a particular way, and that wins it.
I agree with you, at least on paper. That's what you need to do. But the problem is that that's what both sides are facing. both sides are looking at this, particularly if both sides in an election are looking at this purely from the standpoint of like campaigning stuff, like if politics is out of the question, if we're not talking politics here, if we're just talking campaign machines, then yes, you're looking at that 1% of people. You're looking at the states or the regions or the districts or whatever, provincial, federal thing that you're most likely going to get your support from. You're looking for marginal constituencies. You're looking for ridings that you can get the biggest bang for the buck from, whatever it is. And that does create a kind of logic there. But the problem, I guess, I have with this sort of appeal to those industries, those businesses, those foreign agents, in some cases, is that both sides are doing it. Both sides are appealing to the same people in some cases, like the same companies in some cases, to do their work for them. I think that whole process of looking to those marginal votes and trying to sway them over with the least amount of resources possible is what is focusing sort of our political system down a rabbit hole of liberal democracy and very like a very anti-democratic attitude of you don't have to speak to the electorate, you just have to speak to that 1%. You just have to speak to the people who are undecided, and not even the undecided in a broad sense, but the undecided who, like, there are a certain number of people in a riding, for instance, that if you just shook their hand and met them in person, they would vote for you, right? That's the kind of people you want to shake the hands of. Those are the kind of people you want to talk to. That whole idea of this very tiny fraction of people that need to hear your message is one that both parties always have. The Democratic Party did it too. The Republican Party certainly did it. The Republicans presumably had support from the outside, but how much that actually helped is a bit speculative. But the Democrats, to be fair, they spent more money on those analytics. They spent more money and time. They had more operatives doing that work. And it would seem, at least on the face of it, that if anything, they should have won simply on the basis that they spent more money. That is actually how our democratic, quote-unquote, systems work. The party that spends more money does have a better chance of winning. This isn't a choice people make. It's a manipulation of people's minds that happens. And that idea that is really what is at the core of what is so fucking wrong with our political system right now. Outside of the economic problems of capitalism, which I think are creating a pressure cooker in which all of this is sort of getting pushed to its more extreme limits, that very notion, no matter how benign it might be in the first instance, is really what is at the heart of why there is something wrong with democracy in the West. Is that this idea of looking to those marginal votes, of abandoning the more extreme and not even particularly extreme positions as simply unwinnable. That there are people in the province or in the country that, don't bother talking to. They're not going to vote for you. They're not worth your time. They're not worth our time. And all of this being done on the basis of analytics and companies that are in effect apolitical, and I think that's what ends up happening. Is it depoliticizes the entire political process, where it ends up becoming all about identity issues. It all ends up becoming about regional stuff. It like those down, as you said, down to even the personal level, what you as an individual might want. And that ends up turning every single voter into just a demographic that can be manipulated to an amazing degree, certainly. But to be fair, once again, both sides are trying to manipulate people. Le Pen may have had help from Russian hackers or simply the Russian government even. I mean, Le Pen's positions tended to be more pro-Russian than Macron's.
Oh, there was definitely ties there, for sure.
Sure, fine. But Macron had ties to the EU. He had ties to a bunch of fucking other governments. I would argue that the fact that we heard about Le Pen's ties before the election happened suggests a manipulation of voters far more effective than whatever Le Pen was doing.
Yeah, although I have to say that it's not a recent phenomena that, those marginal voters, that 1 or 2% of people that are undecided, this isn't a recent development. Elections, in my entire lifetime, that I can remember have always come down to those, small group of people, liberal one week and NDP the next, and then conservative the next week. And people that don't have, for whatever reason, don't have a party that they support for, principled reasons, or they don't have or they think that, I've heard people say that, you support the NDP because you're not able to make up your own mind on things. You just get your opinions from your political party, like some automan, not like me, who makes up their mind based on a rational, gathering of information.
Well, yeah, I don't have any problem with people changing their minds. I think the major thing is that I don't think people are rational in that sense of that we can just absorb facts and then derive the truth. And that truth, if we were all given the same facts, we would all derive the same truth, kind of thing.
Oh, we could have opposite
but
interpretations.
I mean, we have, there are material and class interests that put people into conflict. And those are sort of the overarching issues of the day, certainly. But there are smaller ones, just habits and prejudices and, I don't like him because he has a bad haircut kind of attitudes that do, in fact, inform people's votes. And people aren't rational in kind of an objective sense. But I think that, in all honesty, I don't really care. Democracy isn't about it's not like democracy is a right people have because we're rational. It's because we're human beings. It's because this idea, this principle of being able to make those decisions, being able to vote, being able to choose what we want, I think is much too restricted and truncated and bureaucratic and obtuse as it is now under parliamentary systems, certainly. But even in that, apparently that's still too much, because it's, even here, even just voting for a representative who will just do what the constituency wants. Apparently the constituency is still too extreme, and the representative has to just do whatever is in the best interests of just the status quo, just getting on. I think that the ideal of democracy is one that really can't be abandoned, or shouldn't be abandoned, really under any circumstances. It's so important, not just for some stupid vague, we have the right to democracy reason, but because by voting for what we want, by fighting for what we actually want, we make elections matter in a way that they can't under any other circumstances. Not just because the results matter and we get, what we wanted necessarily, but because if we make the wrong choices, we will live with them. And that's something that democracy is supposed to be able to do for us. That we are, the whole idea is that the reason we're responsible for our governments is because we elected them. Because they're our government. They're the one we chose. They're the one we made a choice on. And on the basis of what it does, we can then choose to pick something else. We can learn, we can develop, we can progress, essentially. And I think democracy is the only system, if you even want to call it that, or principle, that is really compatible with progress. The system of the campaign machine of turning the democratic system of parliamentary systems from their limited democratic process into this even more truncated, even more limited just choice where you just, every 4 years you get to check a box and then you go home and don't think about it until the next day, essentially. It really turns the whole thing into just a rubber stamp and leaves democracy as almost, I'd say, effectively abolished in most cases. If people were that disinterested in their choices, if people were that undecided, if the population was undecided literally up until they got to the ballot box and then they finally, through some random process of the brain, checked one box and not the others, I mean, at that point, how does democracy differ from just a dictatorship? How does it make any? How is there any clear differentiation between that and just a rubber stamp? Because, you and me and many other people have opinions and positions that are perhaps extreme or at least very entrenched, and we defend them and we argue for them, certainly. But that's the only way you can actually make decisions. I mean, that's the only way you can really make a case for something. To be the kind of mindless automaton that just, picks whatever name is at the top of the list That's, to me, the exact opposite of democracy.
Okay, well, I'm going to play devil's advocate here just for a moment. What would happen if tomorrow there was an EU-wide referendum on whether or not they should deport all the refugees or not?
Yep.
What do you think would happen?
They would probably deport all the refugees.
Yeah, so sometimes people are wrong, right?
Sometimes people are wrong, but I would advocate that they are in fact wrong as well. The problem with the alternative there, like let's say the EU said, oh, well, we're not going to do that because obviously that would be really disruptive. It is exactly that kind of mentality that has inculcated people with this attitude towards immigrants in the first place. It's the EU that has essentially created a racist environment in which immigrants are a problem.
How has the EU created that? Is that not the consequence of wars in the Middle East and
well, sure.
climate change?
Okay, there are wars in the Middle East, and there are refugee crises, and there are certainly, inevitably we always can come back to just blaming it on capitalism, and I think it deserves to be blamed. But
yeah,
if we're talking about the EU in particular and like the decisions of the population of the European Union, I think that would it be right for them to deport those people? No, of course not. I advocate against that. I would strenuously advocate against that. I would clearly advocate against that. I really couldn't tell you how much I would advocate against that. But to take that advocacy, that argument, that political argument, and to transfer that into a bureaucratic administrative fiat is an utter mistake. Because A, it doesn't hold up very well, because people eventually just decide that they end up associating democracy with attacks upon their livelihood, and that is the real danger that fascism can latch upon. Is this idea that when democracy is subverted for the sake of stability, it doesn't help stability, it hurts democracy. If we were to, and this is what's been happening in the EU, if we were to subvert people's interests for the sake of letting immigrants in because it's the humanitarian thing to do, what it does is it inspires fascist and proto-fascist movements. And if that continues on with no serious alternative, those fascist movements will eventually come in, and the immigrants won't be deported at that point. They'll just be killed.
In my previous comment, I wasn't trying to criticize the fundamentals of democracy or anything like that, but more that in the context of a capitalist democracy, where on one hand you have structural problems of unemployment and underemployment, and on the other hand you have a wave of refugees coming in, creating a very easy scapegoat for working class people to blame for the problems that have nothing to do with the refugees. Then in that context, if you were to hold a vote in the EU on whether or not you should just deport them all, then yeah, of course people would vote for the reactionary position. But I think, my point in bringing this up is more that there isn't really a solution, democratic or not, in the current capitalist economy, in the current context. Like, we can appeal to democracy or not, but in any case, the status quo isn't going to fix the unemployment problem, and it's not going to fix is not going to even be able to deal with the refugee problem. You would think that for all that liberals and conservatives tout capitalism as being the best and greatest, most resilient, flexible system that the world has ever known, you'd think it'd be able to deal with a crisis like this, because if it's so great, but it clearly can't. And as such, we have this choice between reaction and status quo, but there's not, there's no, other than Macron, I guess, there's not really any, clear, decisive alternative to this dichotomy.
Well, sure. I guess I was just going on a rant about how wonderful democracy would be. But you're right. That does get into like a much bigger question, which we don't really have time here to debate. But this whole issue of why hasn't an alternative come about? Essentially, we have all these, particularly in the French election. All these, the whole panoply of options were sort of spewed out all at once. And yet the left argument didn't just rise to the top and it didn't win the presidency. There is something more going on here than just appealing to left arguments and just leaving it at that. I don't really have a good answer to that question. I guess ultimately I think that if socialists are to be able to offer serious counter arguments, there's a lot of groundwork that needs to be laid first. A lot of preparation, a lot of organizational sort of stuff, the kind of training, and in some cases even just retraining of the principles of democracy, of socialism, of even just debate that need to happen. And that's a massive task, and particularly in an election, that's not a task anyone wants to take up. When the French election's going on, if you're one of those guys who's going around saying, you know what we should be doing, we should be learning how to debate, we should be learning about Marxist economics, or what is capitalism, or all that kind of crap, people ignore you, and rightly so, because there's an election going on, and the goal is to win. The goal is to get our guy as many votes as possible, and hopefully propel him into the second round. Now, that didn't happen, but whatever. But I think that's the real ground game that needs to happen before a real alternative takes place. And so long as that hasn't happened, so long as we don't have kind of that infrastructure in place, our own infrastructure, our own administration, in a sense, our own stuff that we can rely on to sort of defend and articulate our ideas and our positions, we will be kind of just getting blown around by right-wing populism and liberal austerity.
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing that the right wing is really good at, especially the new sort of alt-right populist right wing that we've seen, is easy, clear-cut answers to complicated problems.
Yeah,
right?
Sure.
That's what they do best.
Well,
you're not unemployed because of capitalism is structurally flawed and this is why. You're unemployed because of the Muslims or the Mexicans or whatever, and it's a way easier answer, and a lot of people like easy answers, and they're really good at giving them.
Well, they like an answer. I mean, when you have the alt-right giving easy answers and the establishment basically saying everything's fine, what's wrong with you?
Yeah.
At least you get an answer, some kind of answer.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I think that's one thing that us as socialists need to focus on a lot going forward is being able to connect with people and give them a real answer. I guess the task going forward is just to continue working to educate people on why capitalism is a decrepit, shitty system, and that immigrants are not your enemy, and all working class people are on we're on the same page, we're in the same boat, we have the same struggle, we have the same interests, and we should unite together for a better world.